Dr. Nikki Jamieson is a suicidologist, researcher, author, and social worker, and holds both a Masters and Ph.D. in suicide in Australia. Her thesis concerned moral injury and suicide. Nikki is considered a global expert on moral injury and suicide and has led innovative research on the topic. She is also widely published, has authored 2 books, several papers, a microeducation app, and is a keynote speaker nationally and internationally. Nikki has also worked strategically within suicide prevention across a range of government departments, including the Department of Veterans Affairs, Queensland Health, Queensland Mental Health Commission and Defence, and has been involved in a range of projects including the development and implementation of Queensland Suicide Prevention Plan and Defence and the DFA's mental health and well-being strategies. Nikki has also been involved in the lived experience space for many years after losing her son to suicide while he was serving in the Army. Nikki remains actively engaged in suicide prevention with memberships nationally, internationally, and locally, including International Association for Suicide Prevention Australia, Standby, and Post-Prevention Australia, and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. She has advocated for better mental health, well-being, and suicide prevention for Defence members and veterans, including being instrumental in the current Royal Commission for Defence and Veterans Suicide.
Welcome to another episode of Moral Injury International. I'm Marty O'Connor here in Melbourne.
And I'm Leo Quinlan here in County Kerry in Ireland.
And we are joined by our special guest, Dr. Nikki Jamieson. Nikki, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
And good evening from 11 o'clock in Ireland, 11 p.m. The time difference, you know. It's always very interesting.
It is,
anyway,
especially with the daylight savings.
Yes.
Yeah. Nikki, if I could just kick off moral injury, you know, there'll be some people that will be watching this podcast for the first time will say that might be the first time they hear about moral injury. Now, I know you're pretty well up on moral injury, probably even way ahead of Marty and I, but what we generally do is just in layman terms, we try to say what moral injury is. And we started out 4 years ago talking about moral injury from the military point of view. We know it goes everywhere else in every other walks of life, but just purely from the military point of view, we kind of say that moral injury occurs where soldiers suffer some traumatic experience and are then betrayed by higher authority, just ignored, thrown on the scrap heap, denied, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, that leads to some significant side effects, things like they go silent. And Marty and I know people who suffer this as well. They don't talk about what happened to them or why it happened to them. They have problems with interrelationships. They have lose jobs, broken marriages, mental instability. They drink a bit too much, and that's a common factor. And they go into deep depression, and unfortunately, for some, it leads to taking their own lives. So we have that kind of a scenario. And Marty and I, in our podcast, we've come across a wide range of people, not just in military sector, but in other sectors. And they all, it's the same story with all of them. So this evening, the floor is yours, as we'll say. I understand from what I've read about you, what Marty's told me about you, that you are an authority on moral injury yourself. And we'd love just to let you talk. Tell us where you come from, particularly within the context of moral injury, and just tell us whatever you would like to tell us about moral injury, your relationship with it, how it has affected you, and so on. And we'll jump in every now and again if we want to clarify anything. But basically, the floor is yours, and please, off you go.
Sounds good. Thank you. Oh, goodness, moral injury. So where to start? So I've been, I guess, catapulted into the moral injury space now for over 10 years. Basically, in a nutshell, moral injury has grown significantly in the research, particularly since COVID, when we saw a lot of, healthcare professions in particular being impacted. But fundamentally, in its rawest form, it really is that deep, that lasting psychological and spiritual distress that, as you rightly pointed out, can lead to all sorts of symptoms, that deep senses of shame, that guilt, those self-loathing behaviors, and sadly, we also see increased risk of suicide, which is where I have a particular interest between the connection between moral injury and suicide. So I'm also a suicidologist. So how did I get into this space? Well, interestingly enough, I kind of started out life as a normal everyday family, growing up in Northern England. My family was from Liverpool originally. I grew up in Yorkshire when my family moved to Yorkshire. Very working class, dad was in the pits, mum was a stay-at-home mum. And then the world kind of flipped on its head when I lost my mother very suddenly. She died in front of me when I was 12 years old. That was incredibly traumatic. And we think about the moral elements of that as a daughter and the things you expect from your mother. She's not there anymore. So those moral, well, why did she leave me? Why did this happen? What's society doing about it? In the meantime, my father became an alcoholic. He didn't cope with the death very well, and that became a very abusive relationship. So again, morally, we expect our parents to be looking after us and have our backs and take care of us, and that wasn't happening. And at the same time, family pretty much at the time abandoned us. We were literally left with no food, no gas and electricity, nothing around us to give us that support that we needed as children. So I ended up leaving home and leaving school at 14, and I was homeless. So I had nowhere to go. So I was kind of couch surfing, babysitting for, money. Is at that stage I was smoking, so I needed my cigarettes. My £10 a week, on cigarettes was my budget whilst I'm trying to stay at people's houses and babysitting. So, it was kind of a reciprocal agreement. In the meantime, one of my good friends, she actually had her own social worker. So she'd been through some abuse in her history and she'd been designated a social worker. And I was like, wow, I want one of those. These people are awesome. They are angels. They give you the clothes that you need. They give you the food that you need. Nobody was interested in me. The authorities never really came searching for me. I was never assigned a social worker. And again, when we think about those social responsibilities, I felt really abandoned. And that again was a moral transgression to me. Why am I this worthless human being? Why did she get a social worker and I didn't? I'm in a state of danger and at risk, but I didn't get one. So, there was a lot of things going on for me back then. And then I met my children's father when I was 16 and he was 34. So that probably says a lot about me at the time, but I really needed that stability and probably looking for a father figure. When I look back through it with, 50-year-old eyes, I can see some of those, decisions and why they came about. I can also see why people choose really terrible paths when they're faced with those situations. And, I really feel that the systems do need to be more supportive. And that was one of the reasons I became a social worker, because I wanted to be one of those people that people could depend on, and I could support people and I could help people. And so they didn't have to experience what I had experienced as a child. But it didn't actually start as a social worker, my career. So when I had my son, so I had him, I would have been around 18. I was 17 when I got pregnant, 18 when I had Daniel, my son. When I had him, I really wanted to create an environment for him so he didn't have to struggle the way that I did. So I went back to school. So I did all my A levels or GCSEs and everything because I left school with nothing. Went back to school, ended up at uni, actually started a couple of years of nursing because I knew I wanted to be in that helping profession. But what I was seeing was not good. When we think about moral injury, you know, I predominantly worked in aged care and disability back then. And what I was seeing, people left in their own feces, not being fed or force fed. And I'm talking, you know, 80s, 90s here. So way back before we had a lot of the regulations that we have now. And it was appalling to me. Morally, I could not see myself staying there in the nursing profession, witnessing what I was witnessing at that time. And the fact that I don't really like blood either, that probably had something to do with it. So I thought, okay, this is not really the path for me. What else can I do? And I knew things were bubbling inside that this isn't right. This should have happened. This is just not the way things are. And something was really pressing on me inside. But we didn't have a name for moral injury back then. And when again I look back now, I'm thinking some of those distress elements and those stressors were moral distress and the moral stresses that I was confronting with. And now we see a lot of that in the research and academia, particularly in the healthcare professions. And we've seen it in the aged care sector as well. You know, we had an inquiry into our aged care system, you know, a few years ago, and that really pulled out some absolutely atrocious events that were happening across our aged care system, which would have been incredibly morally injurious for the individuals and the families and the staff in those situations. So anyway, as life plodded on, I transferred my studies into social work. So I actually did, it was called something slightly different in England, but it was basically around working with children and families, working in the community in a social work context. So it was more kind of human services. So I did that for a few years, working in disability again, and then moved into the university sector. So I was working in education, and particularly for what we called in England minority ethnic groups, and helping them in accessing education and supports. And then I decided, you know, after coming to Australia for a holiday in 2003, because funnily enough, my Aussie mum and dad, who is actually my mum's aunt and is actually my mum's sister, so my aunt. Sadly, she died by suicide a couple of years ago, but she actually tried to adopt me when my mum died when I was 12 years old. But the government systems at the time here in Australia wouldn't allow it. There was much more focus on other country adoptions at that time. So we didn't get a look in, unfortunately. Again, another, you know, moral area of distress for people. So that didn't happen. So, you know, I got there eventually. So I came over here finally in 2005 when I got my visa. So I actually got my visa in 2005, but made the permanent move over in 2006. So I've been here nearly 20 years. And then decided I probably don't want to do social work over here, so I'm going to do something completely different. I've done some short courses in England in hairdressing and done some training in hairdressing, so I was qualified. So I came over here and thought, hey, I'll do some fun stuff for a while. I'm sick of all the heaviness, the doom and gloom stuff. I'm going to do some fun stuff. I'll do some hairdressing. Oh my goodness. So I came over here. Not only did I have to redo my social work degree, I had to redo my hairdressing qualifications because they weren't recognised over here. Because, you know, Australian hair apparently is completely different to English hair. But anyway, I came over here, I did that. I was determined that's what I was going to do and move back into hairdressing for a little bit anyway. Did that for a few years, then realised $7 an hour. Nobody can survive on that. So I did that for a few years and thought, nah, this is not happening for me. Moved back into kind of a social worky type role. So I ended up in education. So working in early years, mental health. So working with children and families, and also working with the system in policy development, particularly for children who had behavioural difficulties or disabilities. And I actually stayed there for the best part of, you know, on and off, it was like 12, 13 years. So it was a big chunk whilst doing secondments out to health and actually working as a social worker with children and families as well. And that was interesting because now I was working in an environment, when we think about moral injury, I was working with a bunch of pediatricians and psychologists because we had, a disciplinary team when we're working with children and families. And, I remember having conversations with pediatricians about families and children specifically that were coming through and they couldn't get the resources, they couldn't get the funding from the department to be able to support them in their education. So pediatricians, and you could see it written all over their faces, they were having to make diagnoses of children regardless of whether they had a diagnosis just to get that child's support. It was terrible. And that still happens now. We see it with ADHD, we see it with ASD, we see this overdiagnosis, and there's lots of research to support that. And I was working in an environment that was also forced in that position. So, inevitably I moved back into more of a strategic, what we call a macro level role, which is where I've always been more comfortable as a social worker. I like to make change behind the scenes and make all that really big policy strategic change that can hopefully do good for many, many people. So I did enjoy that one-on-one face-to-face stuff, but I really do prefer making big changes. And that has kind of, gone along in my life. Even today, that's what I continue to do. I make those broad changes, particularly to support our military, our veterans, and our first responders. So that kind of leads us to, well, around 2014. Oh, that was the year when my whole world shattered, completely shattered. So by then, I'd had two children. So there was Daniel, my eldest, he was born in 1993. And my daughter was born in 1998, but sadly she died of pneumonia a couple of years after that. So I'd already been through the loss of one child. 2014 saw me lose Daniel. So Daniel was in the army here in Australia, been in for a couple of years. He was posted into Darwin, which for those who are not Australian is the very northern tip of Australia, and it's very, very hot. Lots of crocodiles.
Yes.
Yeah, so he was posted there. And, for the 6 months prior to him ending his life, he did die by suicide whilst he was in the army. Things were not going so well for him. When I look back at some of the messages we had and some of the conversations that we had, what I now understand is Daniel had experienced and was experiencing a moral injury because he was betrayed by those that he had trust in. So Jonathan Shea, when he talks about moral injury, it's that betrayal of trust by a legitimate authority. Well, in the military, your command is your legitimate authority. Your colleagues are who have your back. It really is life and death. You trust each other with your life. So when that goes sour and people, stab you in the back, that is incredibly morally injurious, and that has deep, deep wounds that can increase the risk of suicide. And unfortunately, that is what contributed to Daniel's suicide. Now, that's not to say that moral injury, if you're morally injured, then that's it, a person will go on and die by suicide. Suicide is incredibly, incredibly complex and multidimensional. It is never one thing that leads to the death of somebody by suicide. Never. There are far too many facets of the human condition for us to pinpoint just one thing. There certainly are events that may be, proximal and distal, they may be in the area of that death. Absolutely. That can be relationship breakdown. It can be financial struggles. Rory O'Connor, who's one of the leading suicidologists in Ireland, you may know of him. He is brilliant. I absolutely fangirl him. He's amazing. He actually talks about the tipping point. So, people can have all these factors in their life and not really, act on anything. But then there might be an event in life where there's a tipping point, and that tips people over the edge, and it turns from people thinking about suicide to actually acting on those thoughts. And sadly, for some people, that's dying. And moral injury is one of those contributing factors because it can be enduring and it can be long lasting. And, as Leo pointed out at the beginning, what often happens is moral injury likes to take people away. It likes to isolate people. It makes you feel like you are a terrible person. You are not good. You're not deserving of love. You're not deserving of family and friends, of colleagues. So you just need to take yourself away and isolate yourself and withdraw. And we do know that can increase the risk of suicide. It also makes people feel like they're a burden. We also know that burden, being a burden to somebody, can also increase the risk of suicide as well. So there's lots of elements within moral injury that strongly connect to what happens when we see people, in suicidal distress as well, and sadly for those who die by suicide. So 2014 was here. I had uniformed officers turn up at my workplace and tell me my son had died. For the parents in the room, I'm sure you've just felt that drop in your gut and that feeling that, oh my goodness, I cannot imagine anything like it. Well, you're right. It is absolutely hell on earth. There is nothing that can possibly articulate or describe the loss of a child. I thought it was bad when I lost Rachel, my daughter, but to lose a child through suicide is a completely different type of grief. And bearing in mind, I have lost my whole entire family, siblings, parents, children. I'm not a stranger to death and I'm not a stranger to grief. But hand on heart, the death of my son was nothing like I've ever experienced in my life. And even now, obviously I still think about Rachel 20 years later, but a suicide death is just, it's just so raw and there's just something about it that just doesn't really heal. And same with moral injury. People often talk about healing with moral injury. I completely disagree with that. Very similar to a grieving process, depending on your relationship with the person and with the moral injury. What happens is, I don't necessarily think we heal, because how can we be that person we was before the event or death happened? What I believe is we go on and we repair or we restore. There's that Japanese, what's that? There's that thing that they do with the vases. They break the vases and then they put gold leaf through all of the cracks to make this beautiful vase. And I'm sure your viewers are thinking, oh, it's so and so, just say it. And I can't think of the word, but there is a technique that they use and it makes the vase much more beautiful, much more, stronger and just much more visible. Well, I believe that's what happens with moral injury repair. And I believe that's what happens when we repair through grieving processes as well. We are never that same person. We are never that vase we were before it got shattered on the ground. But the people that we can be after that is something that has so much, tenacity, resilience, rigor, robustness, and strength. And it really is that post-traumatic growth piece that, really interests me as well. And I'm a walking, talking example of that. So Daniel died in 2014. That led me onto my own suicide journey. So I was not in a good place. I'd also decided at multiple points that I was not going to be here anymore, and I acted on those multiple points. After coming around from, I guess, the attempt, the last attempt that I had, I really did have, it wasn't an aha moment, but it really was one of those decision points in life where if I am going to continue to live on this earth, things need to look very, very different. I cannot keep doing this to myself. I cannot keep doing this to other people. But what does that look like? And I guess that's when the fire in my belly really started to roar. I needed to know, what is this thing we call suicide? What is it? Tell me about it. I need to learn about it. I need to uncover every single aspect of this thing called suicide. So I know what went on for my son, and I need to know that this wasn't only him. So that's what I did. I embarked and did a master's in suicidology. And at the same time, I actually started a PhD. I do not recommend that people do a master's and a PhD at the same time. I don't know what was going on in my mind at the time, but I was absolutely on a mission that I was going to find
I know the feeling.
Yes. And then that was actually what led me to uncovering moral injury. So it's through that process. I was actually looking at some Senate inquiry reports here in Australia, and it was a psychiatrist who is an absolutely amazing psychiatrist here in Queensland. He kind of flippantly mentioned the term moral injury in one of his submissions, and I thought, oh, moral injury, what is this? So, you know, my little researcher brain got in there and I'm having a look and doing some Googling. And I'm like, and I just had that, whoa, that hit in the chest moment, that hit in the guts moment. This is it. At this point, I'd been diagnosed with PTSD, adjustment disorder, depressive disorder, anxiety, you name it. I'd got all of these labels thrown at me because I'd lost my son to suicide. And I'm like, nah, this is not it. I know grief. I fully have immersed myself in the grieving process for many, many years. This is not that. Or the feelings and thoughts I was, you know, trying to process were not that. There was something very different. And it wasn't until I actually realized there was this thing called moral injury that it was the aha moment for me. And I thought, goodness, is that just me? Could this be happening elsewhere? So that was it. I was down the rabbit hole, and my PhD was focused on moral injury and the intersect between moral injury and suicide. The original focus was on our veterans and military members, and it was very much a qualitative study. So I was in the weeds with people who had experienced moral injury and suicidality, suicide distress with them, you know, working with them, going through their journeys with them, and actually taking their journeys and turning them into a book, which will probably be at the end. So that's pretty much their stories that I worked with. So fast forward a couple of years. So when Daniel died in 2014, there was a petition on for inquiring into defence and the Department of Veterans Affairs systems here and the connection between suicide. So it was a petition for a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. And at that point, I was redlining. I was, you know, all guns were ready and aiming at defence. It was the whole reason why I wanted, or one of the whole reasons why I wanted to do as much as I could in suicide and do a PhD, because I wanted to be as armed and as weaponed as possible when I go head to head with defence on this one. That was my intention. Funny how things turn around, and we'll get to that shortly. So once I'd done all this and got into it and built my networks, I'd seen there was the petition for the Royal Commission. I was there. I was in there in a heartbeat. I was, you know, gung-ho, yes, we need this change. Yes, this is what's happening. And it wasn't until a few years later when Julianne Finney lost her son, David Finney, to suicide. He was a Navy member and, you know, he'd been in service for, gosh, I think it was like 20 to 30 years and was transitioned out and sadly lost him to suicide. And she was very much, you know, a presence, a strong presence in the media. And her and I connected, as well as Karen Bird. So she lost her son, Jesse Bird, which was all over the media as well. So as mothers, we came together, and boy, were we a powerful force. There was a few of us mothers who came together. There was myself, there was Julianne, there was Karen, there was Jan Hewitt, there was Colleen Pillen, and there was also Glenda as well. So we came together and we literally stormed Parliament. And it ended up, we were, you know, not moving out of Scott Morrison's office. He was the PM at the time, until we had a decision on a Royal Commission. At this point, I'd got my master's and my PhD had been written, and it was just about to be published. So I was there. My cannons were firing at the Prime Minister, like, come on, you want to, you know, you want to go, let's go. So, and we obviously brought our lived experience context, but we also brought 500,000 signatures as well from the Australian public demanding a Royal Commission into defence and veteran suicide. So needless to say, we got it across the line, and I was the first one to actually do the first ever public submission in the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, and that was way back in November 2021. So fast forward a few years on, the Royal Commission ended a year ago. The final report was released a year ago, so it ended a year ago. There was 122 recommendations, and I was so relieved that recommendation 78 is wholly and solely dedicated to preventing, treating, and minimising moral injury. And given I was the first person to actually mention and talk about moral injury, both academically and a lived experience in the Royal Commission, there was then over 4,000 mentions of moral injury throughout the Royal Commission. So I really do feel that, you know, there was a snowball from that very first submission, and then that, you know, expedited all of the interest in moral injury. Of course, we had COVID as well in that 2021 period, so the research was really starting to come to fruition then as well. And I just think all of the stars aligned at that point, and now we're in a position in Australia where not only do we recognise moral injury, we also have it firmly embedded as a moral problem in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual in the 5th revision, which for our clinicians, if there's any clinicians on the line, this is the supplementary information that you need to be able to treat your clients. And what we're finding is people can treat clients under the moral injury Z code. So it's Z code 65.8 for those who are interested in the DSM. But also we can also use that platform as part of the PTSD diagnosis as well, because what we're finding is PTSD is the go-to diagnosis, but it's often mistaken or misdiagnosed, and often it's actually moral injury. What this means is if you go and treat somebody with gold standard PTSD treatments, which would work for PTSD, normally, if that person has what I call purest moral injury, so 100% moral injury without PTSD, but you go treat them with the PTSD prolonged, gold standard treatments, it's likely you're going to do harm. That person is probably likely to spiral and their treatment will not go anywhere. Sometimes that's often considered as resistance, being treatment resistant. So Lorraine Smith McDonald in Canada actually did a study quite recently on treatment resistant combat veterans, and she developed a treatment approach called 3MDR, where she actually tracked the moral injury first. What she found is that PTSD actually dropped by 30 points on the original scale. So it drastically improved the PTSD if you treat the moral injury first. And Lorraine's is not the only research that tells us that. So part of my work is saying, you know, if you look at the presenting symptoms, obviously whatever is the most distressing and the most prioritized symptom, you would treat that first, but think about moral injury first, because that will help to resolve some of the issues that people might be seeing in a PTSD diagnosis as well. So fast forward up to about 3-4 years ago, when I said I was armed and cannons were ready to go for defence, I actually was offered a position at the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is, for those that don't know, is basically the function that our veterans use to get support and treatment, but also provides support and treatment for families as well. So I was working in the department. One of my other passion areas is lived experience. So I was working on developing a lived experience and peer support program for DVA, so we can really understand what's happening for veterans and understand what they need, working with them, you know, doing with, not doing to. So I was there for a little while, and then lo and behold, I got a tap on the shoulder. So Defence were knocking on my door. Would I please come and work for them, with them, in their suicide prevention space? And I'm like, isn't this interesting? So I thought, you know what? I could have gone down the whole legal road with Daniel. I absolutely could. But what would that have achieved? That may have satisfied me for all of, I don't know, 6 months, a year. But my goal and my mission throughout my life and my career is to help as many as possible. So I thought the best way I can do this is to actually be in defence, changing the system, changing the policies and doing what I possibly can with the constraints and parameters that we have in any government organisation, what we can do to help change the system from within. And I truly believe there has been some magnanimous changes since I've been there. And I truly believe there's a lot more willingness and openness in defence now to actually take some of those initiatives and roll with them. So that's kind of where I'm at now. So I do part-time in my defence role. So nothing I say on this podcast is, you know, defence oriented. It's me in my personal role and me in my Moral Injury Australia role, which is my own little kind of side hustle business that offers, particularly for organisations, veterans and first responders, training and supports. Because now in Australia we have the updated psychosocial legislation, which means even as individuals, we can potentially be sued if we are not supporting a psychosocially safe work environment. And moral injury is rapidly being seen as a psychosocial risk. So a lot of my work is actually doing training for organisations to help them mitigate some of that risk. And in turn, we can work towards minimising moral injury where possible. I don't believe we can totally prevent moral injury at all. That would mean turning us all into robots. We are morally injured because we are human. We are living the human experience. We have morals, we have values. Of course, they're going to be impacted upon. If we didn't have those, we would be robots. So there's always going to be something that, you know, presses on our moral framework. And there's a continuum of moral injury. And what I say that looks like in practice is there can be a moral bruise. So for instance, you might be walking past a homeless person in the street and you go get your $7 mocha choca chai, whatever, $7 or $8, however much the coffees are costing now, and you don't put $1 in the homeless person's cup. That may be morally, you know, morally bruising, morally distressing for some people, where others would be like, yeah, whatever, get a job, loser, depending on whatever the moral framework of that person is. That's what I call a moral bruise. They're often, you know, oh, yeah, that felt a bit stingy. That didn't feel a bit right. But you can recover pretty quickly and get on with life and not really have too much impact. When we see the moral distress, that's where things start to get a bit irky, because that's where some of those initial symptoms of moral injury might start to just, you know, be kind of pressing on you a little bit. But again, with the right supports and intervention, when somebody is feeling that moral distress, it can either go two ways. We can go and it turns into a moral bruise and people can recover and repair very quickly. Or if they continue and they accumulate, especially because moral injury isn't always just one thing, it can be an accumulation, then they can go on and develop a moral injury. When they develop a moral injury, that's when we see those really maladaptive systems. I'm no good, deep senses of shame, deep senses of guilt, anger, distrust, loss of spiritual beliefs, loss of religious beliefs, loss of meaning of purpose, all of those things that can impact the risk of suicide. So that's where I am now. So from all those way back, so I didn't even know what moral injury was, to here now heading up work both on my own, but also in our government departments as well. So yeah. So,
Okay.
Leo, I'm going to let you jump in because I can see you itching there, especially a few words that Nikki said, like the penny dropped, a few things that Leo would say. And then when you spoke about the, you know, we didn't go deep in, but the transgenerational, it's let down. But Nikki, you are just an absolutely amazing what you're talking about. I'm going to kick this over to Leo because I know I've seen him making notes there. He thinks he's hiding them, but I can see them. Off you go, Leo.
No, a couple of things. You're an amazing lady. You're a very strong lady, mentally very strong. You must have a very strong heart. Inside, I take my metaphorical hat off to you, Nikki. What I found interesting from the word go was that, looking back on it, that you were suffering from moral injury at the age of 14. You used words that, to Marty probably twigged it as well, You used words that we've been using a lot about betrayal by higher authority. The person that should have been helping you didn't help you. The same in the army. The top brass in the army didn't help the soldiers when they came home. And we're not just talking about the Irish army. It's in every army. It's in police forces. It's everywhere else. But you now can recall it from the age of 14 on. And you had no duty of care. So, you know, again, you're validating everything you've said has validated what Marty and I are trying to put out in our podcast over the last 4 years. So thank you for that. That means that we're probably on the right track. I got the impression that you were very lost for a number of years. You were searching for something to do, you know, searching for your mission in life, and you found it. Obviously, you're doing extremely well at it. You mentioned the word shame. We have a colleague who wrote a book, Moral Warriors, Moral Wounds, about 20 years ago or less. And he says the same thing, you know, what did I do wrong and so on. I'm ashamed and hiding my shame. I sometimes argue with him about that. In our situation where Marty and I are talking about, where we met, I don't think shame came into it per se, but however, that's whatever. Also, but the healing, you know, when you understand what moral injury is, you can understand what the other person is suffering, and, you know, denial by higher authority and so on and so forth. It's not easy to repair moral injury unless you do get some help from outside. And just while I was running to my mind, I think the Japanese word you were probably looking for, I could be wrong, is kintsugi. Kintsugi.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
There's one thing that you said it near the end, and we're very hot on this thing about moral injury, particularly in our case. Marty's father and my father were in the same battle together. They suffered the same thing, the same time, etc. And because maybe it's because they were fairly coming from Catholic families or whatever, I don't know. But moral injury is often described among ourselves as an injury to the soul.
Yeah.
An injury to the soul. Completely, as you've said, different from post-traumatic stress. And people can get the two mixed up. And it's interesting that you said that if people treating somebody with moral injury, treat them with the book for post-traumatic stress, they can actually cause further damage. One question before I finish on this thing. A few weeks ago, we interviewed another lady from Bernadette Boss from Australia, and she made a point about that in the Australian Defence Forces, but it goes for everything in higher authority, when you're trying to get things done, one person can stop everything. So one person in power. Everybody runs up against that person. I maybe just wondering if you have run up against that kind of thing, and how did you get over it? And then, if you wouldn't mind mentioning something, if you have come across it, the transgenerational effect, as Marty mentioned, of moral injury situations that you've come across.
Can I just, before you answer that, Nikki, I just picked up something that hit home with me. You said something there. We're talking about moral injury and how it affects soldiers and people from all walks of life. But you triggered something there in my head when you said it's the same thing about trusting a parent, because they're your higher authority when you're younger, and you're let down by them.
Yeah.
That you don't get over.
No.
Because that's where you said at 14. I think I realized that when I was 10, because I loved the army, loved my dad. But the minute I seen him do something, whether it's to my siblings, my mother, or myself, you're kind of going, what do you do? Where am I? You know? So anyway, Nikki, please, I just want to throw that in there.
And that's one of the challenges, because, you know, children rely so much on their parents. And when that relationship, you know, doesn't go as well as it could, that also impacts the relationships that child has for the rest of their life. So it's about that attachment. And there are key developmental stages for children where they really do need that additional support. You know, we know the first few years of life, but we also know that those adolescent years as well, when children need that additional support and their minds are much more open so they can absorb things. And, you know, we know about neuroplasticity and epigenetics and all of that stuff. There are periods in a child's life when they're more vulnerable and do need those extra comforts, I guess, to make sure they're feeling safe and can go out in the world feeling safe. And I certainly didn't have that. You know, I did for a few years when mum was still with us, but when she died, you know, everybody's world got turned upside down. So yeah, the thing with moral injury as well, it is very much the biopsychosocial, spiritual, environmental, I want to say condition. It's the thing that is incredibly multidimensional and really incredibly complex. It's multifaceted, multi-leveled, and multidimensional. Very similar to suicide in that way. So it can occur through omission, which means we're not doing something. We failed to do something. We failed to act, for instance, or commission. We've done something that was against our moral values, or betrayal. Or all three. There has to be some kind of potentially morally injurious event for a moral injury to occur. And that can be through omission, commission, or betrayal. When we think about the intergenerational impacts of moral injury, there's now evidence to suggest that that does happen. In fact, Karen May, she's a researcher here in Australia. Her PhD has looked at PTSD and the intergenerational transmission. It also talks about moral injury and the same applying as well. And that can happen because children do rely on their parents as that safety, and that doesn't happen. But moral injury in children intergenerationally can also be because they blame themselves for acting in a way or not acting in a way that they felt they should have. So for their minds, they can't see the world as an adult can see it, and they make all of these connections and the neural pathways get formed, and then we see the problems later on, and that may be increased risk of, you know, alcohol and substance use, maybe really, you know, terribly chosen relationships, all of those things that we start to see, and, you know, sadly for some, increased risk in depression, anxiety, and suicide related behavior as well. So yeah, definitely it does occur intergenerationally. And yeah, Bernadette Boss is absolutely right, and I have a lot of time and respect for Bernadette. We go back a few years.
She's lovely, isn't she?
She's an amazing, amazing human being. And wow, what a lived experience and life, you know, story this woman brings. And yeah, our paths definitely continue to cross. In fact, I saw her just the other day. So it's really lovely to see the work that she's doing and her dedication and continued commitment to this space as well. When we go back to the what can you do question, this is a really tricky one. So I've worked in major government departments, in health, in education, you know, in defence, DVA, in commissions. These are massive, massive machines, massive government organisations. And it only takes, as Bernadette said, one person. And that might be a public servant who's higher up the chain than you, who doesn't know anything about the subject matter, which is an absolute bugbear of mine and drives me insane. But it happens, and that's happened, you know, throughout my career. There are a couple of ways you can do this. You can either, you know, make sure you've got your evidence intact and send that up, and make sure that the people, you know, who are in your team are also on board with it all and understand the evidence and are your allies, I guess, to really advocate for you if it's, you know, above your level. If that doesn't work, then for me, I'm going straight to the top. I'm going to the minister. So, you know, we do things as orderly and in the right way that we do it. But if we are not getting the answers, well, we've seen it, what happened with the Royal Commission. It's just like, now we've tried playing your way, we go straight to the top and we get that change happening on some way or another. But again, you need your allies on that. One person turning up in a minister's office isn't going to do too much, but you've got 500,000 signatures behind you. You can guarantee there's going to be something changing.
Yeah.
Interesting. Marty and I started this moral injury thing 4 years ago when we first came across it. I think it was January 2021, nearly, 5 years ago, almost.
I was about to correct you, but anyway.
I know. He always does. And I need it sometimes. But we are laymen at it. We have a certain knowledge of it. So it's lovely to hear from somebody like you who studied it, a PhD and master's degree, etc., in relation to moral injuries and so on. Very much appreciate what you've been telling us. It gives me a bit of comfort that Marty and I are on the right track in what we're doing. But what's also very interesting is that there's moral injuries begin to creep in as an educational subject in armies, etc. Just 2 days ago, I became aware of it in the British Army, where they're running courses for 60 different nations for senior officers from 60 different countries, and moral injury is one of the topics that's presented. Yeah, which is interesting. And I give talks around the place. I'm asked to give a talk next week about the Jadaville factor that Marty and I have links with. And the people say, please, we'd like to know the aftermath of the event and the moral injury factor. They're actually asking to be educated on moral injury. And these are all professional people. So it's comforting for us that people are listening, not just to us, but to you and to many others. So moral injury is becoming, for the want of a terrible word, better word, the flavor of the month, or whatever. And we must keep going like that, make sure the flavor remains.
And we're finding the same. There's so much appetite now, particularly since the recent changes to the psychosocial legislation. And if you look at the psychosocial elements, there's 17 of them. So things like trauma, things like bullying, poor change management, poor job control, poor justice, lack of reward, lack of recognition, all of those things absolutely contribute to moral injury. So we need to start intercepting and doing more upstream and early intervention, I guess, pieces. And part of that is the education piece. And we're seeing such appetite now in Australia for people wanting to know more about moral injury, and that sense that when they do know what moral injury is, you can see the lifting of people like, that's what it was, or that, and they just get it. It just resonates with people once they understand what it is. And, you know, people like myself and Bernadette and the work that, you know, I do with Lindsay Carey and some of the others in the moral injury space is really starting to bring that message home. In the UK, they're in a really good position because they actually have the International Centre for Moral Injury in Durham.
We've been interviewed on that show.
Well, they've got a conference coming up next year. There's also our conference here in Australia, which is in Tasmania, and that's the ANZ Moral Injury Conference, and that's in May next year. And I'll be there as both a keynote and a presenter if people are interested. And that's
well, make sure you let us know as well. Yes, we were on Durham University on a Weber, and with Dr. Brown Powers, and moral injury is growing, and other people like What Makes a Difference, a kickoff from the British Army with Rich and Ali. They have that podcast that we've been on, and they've been on our podcast. Is they're doing theirs for moral injury, and I think it's just great what we're doing now. Nikki, we're running out of time because I could talk to you. You'd be delighted. You're going, oh my God, give me 35 minutes notice, and poor old Leo, I had to give him 5 minutes notice. I mixed up the time difference all over the world. But I'm going to let Leo finish it off as we go. But if I can ask one last question with you is can you give it advice to people? And I mean this, not just the moral injury side of it, on losing Daniel, and your son may rest in peace, on suicide, and finish up. What advice would you give to people that are listening to this podcast all over the world, please?
Both moral injury and suicide is about relationships. Both can be grounded and founded in relationships. Moral injury can be, moral injury can be made and cured via a relationship. It really is about that social connection and having your tribe, having your people for both. And your tribe may change. you know, I certainly find when we lose somebody, you know, whether it be natural causes, accident, whatever, your tribe changes, people change, and people drop off. Probably 98% of the people in my life now were not in my life before Daniel. And those people that were in my life with Daniel are no longer in my life. And that includes family. People just drop off when a death occurs. It brings out the best and worst in people. So I would say, build your connections and keep your connections where you can, you know, even though it's difficult sometimes because you do just want to withdraw and you're sick of people and you don't want to be, you know, bothered with all the hassle. Even just sending a text, you know, just saying, oh, I just thought I'd reach out. It's been a while, thinking about you today. I don't expect a response. It's just some level of connection. You would think that we live in such a connected world that we'd all be talking all the time, and it's not like that at all. Statistically, we have never been more lonelier than what we are now. So go and have a cup of tea, you know, go and talk to somebody randomly in a cafe, you know, even though that sounds a bit weird. But if there's a few people sat there on their own, strike a conversation if you feel comfortable in doing. Whatever way, it really is a social connection.
Just some things run through my mind. You know, as a result of moral injury, losing Daniel, and unfortunately your daughter Rachel for other reasons. But you can lose people through moral injury as well without them, let's say, taking their own lives. You can lose them because they go distant from you. They don't talk to you anymore. They leave home, etc. So there's lots of losses apart from just suicide in moral injury. The other thing that Marty and I, in our layman's way of discovery, we've realized that people we've met and spoken to, that when they understand what moral injury, all of a sudden the penny drops and they say, oh my God, that's when my dad was like that. Oh, now I understand why he wasn't talking. Now I understand why he went down to the shed smoking for hours every evening after work and not mixing with the family. Oh, now I know why my dad never ever gave me a hug after he came back from that terrible event, etc., etc., etc. And with the understanding comes forgiveness. And, you know, all of a sudden there's a comfort factor building up inside you. Well, okay, now I understand it. I can relax a little bit better. And it's a healing process, or at least it begins. So that's where we're coming from. But it's lovely to hear you speaking from, let's say, a more educated level, and to some extent validating what we're thinking, if you know what I mean. And for that,
forgiveness and
compassion. Thank you very, very much.
That's okay.
Sorry?
Lovely. I said forgiveness and compassion and acceptance and validation in a non-judgmental frame is actually what helps people repair, recover, and be able to build that meaning and purpose for them as well. So that pretty much forms part of the treatment and support approach for people with moral injury. So it really is about that non-judgment, that being compassionate, helping them with forgiveness where appropriate and possible, and also helping them in validating and accepting those experiences. And that can really help with post-traumatic growth, which is absolutely possible given the right motivation, capabilities, and support. So thank you.
Absolutely, Nikki. And just, I'm going to finish on Nikki is, yeah, you're right. It's forgiving them, but understanding what they went through and the moral injury. A lot of people go on post-traumatic stress and giving pills, and that doesn't help them, as we said. Not that we're qualified to say that you need to get diagnosed properly, but it's I think what it is, forgiveness. And you know my story, we're not going into that now. My story is that I forgive, and it's easy for me to forgive, and I'm not necessarily, I understand them, but my forgiveness has to be for me. Absolutely. So I don't think I was part of the creation of that.
And it's not always about forgiving the other person either. It can be about forgiving yourself for not forgiving the other person, because, you know, you're not going to forget these things. They're part of your new fabric, whatever that looks like.
Correct.
So, yeah, it's about really understanding yourself, because often identity is fractured, completely shattered with moral injury, and that rebuilding process is where we start seeing some of these difficulties as well if they don't have the right supports. But it can be done. It definitely can be done. I'm a walking, talking example.
I was going to say, yeah. There's a couple of us here, but Nikki, you are an amazing woman. Absolutely delighted to talk to you. And Leo, as always, and thank you very much. And for our listeners to watch this show, go to moralinjuryinternational.com. And thank you to the audience here in Australia and all over the world. And we'll see you on the next episode. Nikki, good night. Good morning from us, and good night to Leo.
Good day.
God bless. God bless, Nikki.